The modern soldier is the heir of the prehistoric warrior who was the guardian and champion of the tribe. Forced to pick up a stone to defend against wild beasts, early man soon discovered that weapons could also eliminate danger from rival tribes. Warriors banded together and learned to bring their force to bear against an enemy in coordinated attacks. The stone gave way to the sword of the Roman foot soldier, and infantry battled as massed armies. The sword yielded to the musket. Today's weapons put the strength of a legion in the hands of one soldier.
In the maelstrom of combat, the mirage of glory fades and the infantryman fights on, now as before, motivated by the most basic instinct, survival.
I couldn't stop and think I might be killing some father or son. You can't think about those things. It's either him or you.
German soldiers marched west in 1914 with the intention of crushing the French army with a single mighty blow. But hopes of a quick victory soon vanished. The French dug in and defended their homeland from behind a 400-mile-long maze of barbed wire and trenches. For the next 3 years, with only a few exceptions, the trench line would not vary by so much as 10 miles.
Now, that war had been going on since 1914, and we didn't go in until April the 6th, 1917. And I went in late May in 17.
When America surrendered its neutrality in 1917 to join France and her ally Great Britain, her army was puny by European standards. President Woodrow Wilson ordered a draft to mobilize an instant expeditionary force. By the end of the first day of the drawings, nearly 1.5 million young men had joined the army.
So we were a clean, innocent bunch of kids, and we had to be trained completely. We knew nothing about warfare. Last thing my dad told me, said, be a good soldier. So I, being a good kid, I minded him. And all through the war, I remember what my dad told me, be a good soldier. And I was.
The American doughboys arrived in France well-equipped with the modern weapons of the time, but poorly trained in the tactics of this new warfare. To have marched into combat right away would have been murder. Wisely, the Americans spent many months with their experienced allies learning how to fight in the killing zone called no man's land.
When you're in the trenches, you were constantly, you're living in this special world, a soldier's world, where nothing matters but survival. You adopt an attitude, a fatalistic attitude of you don't know whether you're going to be here tomorrow or not. And so you live for today. You're scared all the time. If you know you're going over in the morning, you hardly sleep at all, and you dread it. I didn't. I took over the top, but you go, and you do the job you're told to do.
In 1915, the Germans added a new, horrible dimension to warfare.
Gas warfare is a terrible monster. A gas attack usually preceded a big attack. And this is the way they hoped to get the first breakthrough our lines, by sneaking up on us and knocking us out with a gas attack. I was gassed twice. Once the gas got into your eyes or your nose, or you were a dead duck because you couldn't breathe, you couldn't see. You think you're a goner, you choke, you can't see, and you burn to be hell. You just think you're a goner. You're gonna die right there. It's a terrible feeling. It's a lot worse than a bullet. I was wounded 3 times. I was machine gunned once through the side, right between 2 ribs, and took off a chunk off my thumb and knocked my rifle just out of my hand as clean as a whistle. And I wondered at first, what did I do? How'd that happen? I didn't even know I was hit. And then I thought, oh boy, was I lucky. And then later on, I got real wet in my drawers. And I thought I'd peed in my pants because I was so scared, but it was the blood running down my legs. The experience of getting shot is no big deal. It happened so quick. Most of the time, you didn't know what hit you.
A single weapon that swept across the shell-pocked fields of the Western Front and cut down waves of infantry attacks, carried the firepower of 100 riflemen.
Machine guns had a massive increase in the rate of fire compared with a rifle. The rate of fire of the rifle was determined by the quickness of the man aiming, pulling the trigger, and putting a new round in. A machine gun could put 600 or 700 rounds a minute. It was used in defensive situations.
The rapid-fire machine gun used the energy generated by firing a shot to load and cock the weapon for the next shot. First developed at the close of the last century, it wasn't until the Great War that armies exploited the potential of the machine gun.
You're not going to go anywhere with an infantry assault if you have machine guns. Every time there's been a new weapon introduced on the battlefield, there's been a countermeasure for it or adaptations have been made. So the First World War is no different. Soldiers adapted with technology. And that's why the tank comes into its own in the First World War, because now you have, in effect, a way to tear up the other guy's wire, put your infantry in behind the tank to protect them from the machine gun fire, get them through the wire so they can close with and destroy the enemy.
To talk about combat and tell you what it's like is impossible. You don't think about killing a man, per se. My reactions was just an object. There was a dark object out there right in front of me, and I had to pump 2 or 3 shots into it, which I did. You just do your job and take care of the enemy to keep him from getting you or your buddies.
Weary after 4 years of slaughter and suffering, the soldiers of the First World War returned home. At last, all was quiet on the Western Front. The hysterical joy of the armistice that silenced the machine guns in November 1918 would soon disappear. In 1919, the Allied leaders gathered outside Paris to design the security they had pledged the world. The treaty they signed at Versailles formally ended one world war, but set the stage for a second. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party convinced the German people that they had suffered enough under the strict limitations of the treaty. He dreamed of revenge. The time had come to regain the territory, the power, and the prestige that Germany had lost at the treaty table just a few years before. By the late 1930s, he brought into the open his remilitarization program: tanks, armored cars, shock troops, an army equipped with the most modern weapons and trained to fight a lightning war. The Army of the United States had dwindled to a small, poorly equipped force that ranked 19th in the world. Its cardboard tanks and wooden machine guns did little to intimidate Hitler's ambitions. September 1st, 1939, the German war machine invades Poland and within a week crushes the Polish army. The sudden victory validates Hitler's use of blitzkrieg, the heavy concentration of tanks, air power, and mechanized infantry. The success of the attacks depends on mobility and massive firepower.
The Germans do a study between World War I and World War II, in which they conclude that infantry combat occurs at 400 meters or less. So instead of having a weapon that'll shoot 2,000 meters accurately, why not have a weapon that can hose down the other guy, which is what you're trying to do. They come up with the MP-44. Now you have a weapon that can fire semi-automatically and fully automatically, a selective fire weapon. And that's the start of the assault rifle that we see today that all these armies have.
When the United States went to war, it was the only army to do so with its infantry armed with the Garand self-feeding rifle. The American M1 Garand rifle held an internal clip of 8 .30 caliber rounds. Each time the rifle was fired, a new round was automatically loaded. This innovation gave the weapon a higher rate of fire than the enemy's bolt-action rifle. But an infantryman armed with a rifle was still hopeless against the many tanks and armored vehicles charging across the battlefield.
Certainly in the early part of the war, if an infantryman faced a tank, he was finished. But by the end of the war, the bazookas had come in.
It's developed by an ordnance officer here at Aberdeen who comes up with a rocket launcher that's 2.36 inches in diameter. He uses metal out of fire extinguishers to make this tube, and he uses a high explosive anti-tank warhead in a rocket.
The finned rocket was tipped with a shaped charge, a hollow cone of explosive focused into a jet of hot gas at high velocity that melted a hole through armor plate.
And that at last gave the infantryman the chance, under the right conditions, to knock out a tank.
The power of the new weapon was obvious. The Germans applied the idea of the shaped charge to their own tank killer, the Panzerfaust. Startled by the success of German airborne troops during the Battle for Belgium in the spring of 1940, the United States began training its own paratroopers a few months later. The American Army realized that paratroopers could strike deep into enemy lines. They could be dropped precisely when and where needed. Burdened with nearly 100 pounds of ammunition, equipment, and weapons, the airborne infantry soldiers first jumped into combat in North Africa in 1942. Organized into larger units, airborne troops played a major part in the success of the invasion of France in 1944. This new mobility enhanced the tactical value of the infantry.
The First World War was really dominated by the machine gun and the trench, and very high casualties. Whereas the Second World War, once the breakout for Normandy took place, it was a war of movement. There was not a lot of advancing across open ground, swept by machine gun fire. We didn't get ourselves into a trench situation anymore. The Germans did not have time to dig a whole mass of fortifications across France. When we got on the French-German border, there were some sort of fortified works which were very difficult to get through, but the Germans did not have any time to build any sort of static line to hold. So it really became an advance, a brief clash, then push on.
The Allied offensive that pushed the German army back across Europe began on the 6th of June, 1944, on the Normandy beaches of France. From across the English Channel came over 4,000 ships, bearing 280,000 soldiers in the largest invasion force ever assembled. Like the soldiers of the First World War, these infantrymen advanced into the face of heavy enemy fire.
All you know is that you're in danger at all times and that you're the one that's facing the enemy head on. You're just subject to it all when you're an infantryman. You're scared as hell, and you know that if you stay on that beach that you're going to get wiped out. And there's no boats back there to back you up because they aren't going to take you off. They left you there, so you got to get in. You got to get up there and get covered. The only way to do it is to knock out the enemy. It's the only way you're going to survive. When we'd make our assaults, why, I would get this sickness in my stomach. I thought I was going to die, you know, or something like that, until the first shot's fired. When the first shot's fired, all that thing goes away. I don't know what happens to it, but it goes away. You don't feel it anymore. You're only concerned with how you're going to get out of this thing alive.
In the first hours of D-Day, Walter Ehlers led his squad inland to take out a German 88mm gun that had been chewing up the Americans on the distant beach.
We were in an unintended position in a hedgerow situation where we had to withdraw back to another hedgerow. So in order to get my squad back, I stood up and fired continuously all around me so that the squad could withdraw back down one of the hedgerows back to the next hedgerow. And then one of my men got wounded. And so I helped him off the field of fire, and I got wounded at the same time. And then I went back and recovered his Browning automatic rifle that he was carrying, because that was one of the only automatic weapons we had with us at that time for a squad, you know, and so naturally we needed that for our firepower. I was trying to save the lives of my men as far as I was concerned, I guess, to get them back under cover, and then I would make it the best I could. I just never thought about myself. I probably was thinking more of them than anybody. But that's the way it is in combat. You don't really think about yourself, you're thinking about what's going to happen to the other guy.
The U.S. Army recognized Walter Ehlers' bravery with the Congressional Medal of Honor.
My brother was my hero. He was, you know, in the infantry too. He was a good soldier. He was a fantastic soldier. My brother was in a different company. They told me he was missing in action, and I figured that, well, he wasn't missing in action. I knew my brother better than that. He landed on D-Day on this LCI, one of these ships, and he had a mortar squad, and he and his whole squad were on the ramp at the same time, coming down, and a German 88 shell hit the ramp and knocked out the whole squad at one time. And I didn't learn that he was killed in action until about the middle part of July. And his company commander came over and told me that he had been killed in action. And all I could do was cry like a baby, but there wasn't anything else for me to do. All these guys that gave their lives for their country are heroes. And you can't take that away from them. They're the ones that really made it happen. And of course, the rest of us survived. We helped make it happen, but the point is that we were all on the line, and it could have been any one of us. And we're just one of the lucky ones that got out of it. I never hated anybody in my life, and I didn't hate the Germans either. They were out fighting for their country. We were fighting for our country, and I just think that we were doing the right thing, and they were doing the wrong thing. They probably thought they were doing the right thing, but I don't think we should hate them for that.
In the Pacific, the U.S. Marine Corps fought the Japanese from island to island for control of valuable airfields. For many months, the Japanese had been able to prepare and strengthen their island defenses in anticipation of an invasion. In February 1945, the Marines headed in to take Iwo Jima.
You never know what to expect. Once you get there, you find out real quick. You just wonder if you're going to get killed or wounded, and if they're going to be wounded, how bad, and things like that. It was scary. I mean, I don't care who you are. You're scared when you go into something like that. Iwo Jima was just something else. I mean, it was so common to see pieces of bodies laying all over. It was a horrendous sight. We had to keep going. We had to reach our objectives. Marine Corps training just told us we had to keep going. We fought as a team, not as an individual.
The Japanese concealed themselves in caves and tunnels.
Most of the time, we never saw them until we were right on top. Once in a while, we'd see them running 50 yards away or something like that. But they were so well hidden in caves and brush, it was tough to spot them. I went over the seawall, and not 20 yards in front of me was a Japanese soldier in the foxhole with his rifle pointed at me. And it seemed like 5 minutes we looked at each other, wondering who's going to squeeze off first. Could have been only a few seconds, but I just squeezed the trigger and blew him away. But no, a second later, that could have been me.
Klavan carried a special weapon, the Browning automatic rifle.
I had the same rate of fire as the light machine gun, about 550 rounds a minute. And we carried 12 magazines with 20 rounds in each one. And each BAR man had 2 assistants to carry extra ammunition because you could eat it up pretty quick. It's a very potent weapon. It's heavy, but one thing I liked about the BAR, when you hit somebody, if he was running no matter what, he went down right now. And he didn't get up again. The only problem was the Japanese didn't like it. And in one ambush that they knocked off almost every BAR man before they even started on the rifleman.
His third morning on the island, Klavan's company began to advance on a Japanese stronghold.
After we gotten about, 25 yards out of our holes, they were waiting for us. And we got the worst artillery, machine gun, and mortar barrage that I've ever seen. I was way out there, and I saw a little hole about 50 yards in front of the lines. I made a run for it. About 10 yards before I got to it, I got nailed in the leg. So I rolled in the hole. The next thing I knew, my assistant, Jojo Faulkner, was on top of me, and the hole was not big enough for myself, much like him. So I told him to get out and save himself. But there's no such thing in the Marine Corps as leaving a buddy, especially if he's wounded. So he bandaged me up, put me on his shoulders, and ran back good 50, maybe 60 yards back to the lines. And I could see machine gun bullets kicking both sides of his legs. He dropped me off at the battalion aid station. He was full of blood, my blood. And so the corpsman fixed me up, another corpsman started working on me. He says, I'm not hurt. He went back to the lines, and that was the last time I saw him. After 42 years, I finally found him. It was a great thrill meeting him. You just don't forget the guy that saved your life. We were constantly fighting day and night. We lost almost our whole company. Some companies were completely wiped out. That's how bad it was. I think I'm lucky. I think the good Lord has blanked out a lot of the really bad things that I've seen. Some guys just never get over it. They remember every last second of it.
Nearly 7,000 Marines died in the battle for Iwo Jima, the costliest of all operations in Marine history.
Sure, it's tough, but the infantry is who gets the job done. They're the ones that take the islands.
It's the soldier's personal weapon, rifle, pistol, submachine gun, that ultimately decides the outcome of the battle. Never before the Second World War had the infantryman been required to master so large or sophisticated an armory, but never before had the foot soldier acting on his own been expected to shoot down an airplane or destroy a tank.
When America joined the United Nations forces fighting in Korea, the role of the infantryman had not significantly changed since the end of the Second World War. He was still armed with the same basic weapons and tasked with the same mission: take and hold ground. But it's the way the infantrymen covered the ground that made Korea a significant step in the development of infantry tactics. The rugged terrain of Korea challenged the infantrymen nearly as much as did combat with the enemy. The steep hills and deep valleys made for miserable obstacles that confronted the soldier at every step. Movement of troops was slowed by the lack of passable roads and bridges. Many units reached their positions exhausted by an arduous climb. In 1951, a Marine Corps battalion made history by securing a hilltop by helicopter. Over 200 Marines with nearly 10 tons of supplies won the high ground without having to fight their way to it. Their air assault significantly expanded the capability of ground troops. By moving entire units, military leaders found that they, rather than their enemy, could dictate the location and time of an engagement. The lessons learned and advantages gained by the infantrymen in Korea wouldn't be completely realized until the following decade. The war in Vietnam was an infantrymen's war. Like Korea or the Pacific Campaign of World War II, the terrain limited military actions to smaller unit engagements. The jungle sheltered the enemy, and it was up to the individual soldier to go in and pull him loose.
My own experience in Vietnam is that I went on a constant patrol while I was there. I was a platoon commander. What we did was really patrol, and patrol, and patrol, and patrol. And any engagement that we would get into would be what is known as a meeting engagement. We'd bump into them or they'd bump into us. And the firefight would be on. The standard tactics of the North Vietnamese Army was to hang on to our belt buckle. If they could hang on to our belt buckle, I couldn't summon up all the supporting arms that I could summon up on the radio. Radio is a wonderful thing for an infantryman. You can call up and get air, get artillery, get naval gunfire, get mortars. None of that's worth anything if they're so close that you can't bring it in and use it.
By the time American forces were fighting in Vietnam, they were moving around the battlefield in an armored personnel carrier. Originally, the M113 had been intended to serve as a combat taxi. Infantry would ride to the front line and then dismount to fight. In Vietnam, there was no identifiable front line, and the tropical climate made it unreasonable to expect the troops to seal themselves inside the APC. They rode on top of the vehicle. From that position, they could fire down on the enemy when contact was made. In 1965, the U.S. Army implemented a new concept called air mobility. This new idea for warfare depended on the coordinated use of transport helicopters and gunships to move large numbers of infantry by air rather than ground.
You have a significant change in mobility because of the helicopter. You can move a lot more troops a lot further, a lot faster with a helicopter.
Perhaps the most significant development of the war was the small caliber assault rifle, concluding, as did the Germans in the late 1930s, that most infantry shooting takes place within 400 yards. The American Army encouraged the refinement of a small, lightweight, general-purpose automatic rifle. The M16 fired a 5.56 millimeter round at a high muzzle velocity. Cursed at and praised, the M16s were controversial from the start. Early problems with the M16 were attributed to improper cleaning of the weapon. By 1969, it was the standard weapon of American forces in Southeast Asia. For many, the Vietnam War suggests a 20th century replay of the War of American Independence. A world superpower trying in vain to crush an insurgent patriot militia, only to find its vastly superior military resources of no avail. December 19, 1989. 4,200 American soldiers leave bases in the United States. In a few hours, they will join nearly 20,000 more soldiers and Marines in Operation Just Cause, the invasion of Panama. Of the troops heading from the United States, 3,000 were paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division. Not since World War II had an airborne operation of this scope and size been attempted. At 1 a.m. on December 20th, H hour, the invasion was on. American forces moved rapidly to overpower Panamanian strongpoints in the cities and the Canal Zone. Because the opposition lacked heavy firepower and tanks, U.S. leaders didn't send in troops overburdened with heavy equipment. Lightly armed soldiers and Marines could respond and maneuver quickly. The combination of Marines, air assault troops, light infantry soldiers, and paratroopers demonstrated the value and unique capabilities of such highly mobile and specialized warriors. Within the first 24 hours, resistance from General Noriega's defense forces almost vanished. coordinated attacks by light infantry forces had worked. Shortly after New Year's Day, Noriega himself was in American custody. Panama could begin its return to democracy. When faced with a heavily armed mechanized enemy, the U.S. Army infantryman enters combat in the M2 Bradley infantry fighting vehicle. Armed with a 25mm cannon, the Bradley can knock out thin-skinned personnel carriers, and with a guided anti-tank missile, the Bradley can destroy even the most heavily armored main battle tanks. Bradley defends its crew and 7 passengers with steel armor, but it is speed that protects the crew of the fast attack vehicle. Used in combat for the first time in Operation Desert Storm, the fast attack vehicles, or FAVs, raced across Iraq on strategic reconnaissance missions at 80 miles per hour. Their speed, nimbleness, and firepower earned the black dune buggies the nickname Ninja Cars. FAVs were the first coalition vehicles into the liberated capital of Kuwait. But even with all sorts of specialized fighting vehicles, the infantryman on foot still bears the responsibility to close with and destroy the enemy.
Regardless of how strong you are or how accurate you think you are, as soon as you get involved in combat and the bullets start flying and fear sets in, you're only half as strong or half as accurate as you think you are. The best way to overcome the fear is to be prepared, and the way you get prepared is you train extremely hard.
At the infantry school at Camp Pendleton, California, Marines practiced their warfighting skills under realistic conditions.
Some people say that tactics is nothing more than getting the right weapon at the right place at the right time. You can never send a Marine where you can send a bullet. And the bigger the bullet, the better it is. That's the philosophy that we try to get across to our unit leaders.
The principle we're getting through to the Marines on the squad level here today is to work as a team, to cover each other as they move, fire discipline, fire control, also movement and movement control.
Oh, there they are. Open up. Get to the fire.
When one team is up or one individual is up and moving, there should always be a 3-to-1 ratio of people putting fire down onto the objective in order to suppress the enemy, so that that Marine, when he's moving, he knows that his buddies are shooting in support of his movement. And it's very important that we keep that fire control and fire discipline up at all times.
On your next rush, I want you to shoot right slightly.
In this exercise, Marines learn they must rely on one another as they practice breaking through an enemy's front line.
By doing that, you're getting inside the enemy, you're in behind the enemy's actual forward lines, you're expanding the breach each time you move through it, and what you do is you put a real hurt on the bad guys that way, because now they're cut off from their command. They can't function. It's the individual rifleman, the machine gunner, or the anti-tank assaultman who's going to take that piece of ground, and that's when the war is won. The Marine has to be a lot smarter. He has to pay attention more to what he's doing. Things happen a lot quicker. They have to think faster on their feet. They have to be able to make a quick, decisive decision. Everyone's a leader at any time.
Any one of these infantrymen could be leading an assault against an objective somewhere in the vast desert of the Persian Gulf. For Operation Desert Storm, 34 coalition nations mustered a ground force of nearly 1 million soldiers. As the air war raged overhead for almost 6 weeks, Infantrymen rehearsed their attacks in anticipation of G-Day, the start of the ground campaign. The war would come down to the same low-tech ingredient that decided so many wars in the past, the spirit of the foot soldier. February 24th, 1991, ground forces headed into combat, not on foot, but in convoys of vehicles that stretched to the horizon. This image shows the value a modern army places on maneuver warfare. In a strategy reminiscent of the First World War, the Iraqis defended themselves behind sand berms and barbed wire. Their crumbling network of trenches and bunkers could not withstand the fast-moving and heavy-hitting coalition infantry. Just 77 hours after the start of the offensive, Allied forces, including elements of the 1st Marine Division, moved into Kuwait City.
The welcome was just amazing. The lady over here, she stopped the car, she pulled out all of her kids. Each one of them had to give me a kiss. Numerous pictures sitting on my lap. One of her children was terrified of soldiers because of the Iraqis, but for the first time, I guess he got over his fear and came over and gave me a hug.
To those who risked their lives, let us never forget those who gave their lives. May God bless our valiant military forces and their families, and may God bless the United States of America.
When the generals have planned and the armies have mustered, the artillery has spoken, and the armor has maneuvered, it's not until the weary foot soldier with a rifle in his hand stands on enemy soil and declares, "This is mine," that a war can be won.